Schumann famously describes Beethoven's Fourth Symphony as a slender Greek maiden between two Norse giants. Certainly, this symphony seems to be overshadowed by its immediate neighbors, the massive Third and the trenchant Fifth. Note that Schumann thinks of a Greek maiden in particular, invoking the classical aesthetic ideals of balance and simplicity. As Sir George Grove writes, the movements fit to their places like the limbs and features of a lovely statue. The Fourth Symphony is indeed a beautiful work, a work of almost Mendelssohnian tunefulness and sunny disposition. In fact, when Mendelssohn became director of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra in 1835, he decided to include this symphony in the program of his very first concert with the orchestra. There is also an operatic quality to the Fourth Symphony, which is not surprising considering that Beethoven began working on it around the time he was revising his opera Fidelio. The symphony was completed fairly quickly in the summer and fall of 1806. Like the First and Second Symphonies, this symphony begins with a slow introduction, much of which unfolds in a mysterious pianissimo. Against the backdrop of sustained B-flat in the winds and horns, broken descending thirds in the strings insinuate the tonic minor. This is the kind of music that seems perfectly suited to setting the scene in some dark, enchanted realm. By the way, some commentators have noticed that both the Fourth and Fifth Symphonies open with falling thirds, but whereas these thirds sound mysterious in the Fourth, they convey primeval energy in the Fifth. Already, Beethoven calls our attention to G-flat, which will play an important role throughout the symphony. G-flat is the flat sixth scale degree of B-flat major, and as such, it experiences a strong gravitational pull towards F. The strange staccato arpeggiation in measures 6 to 12 evokes the uncertain plodding of a lost wanderer. You can also hear G-flat sounding together with F in a pungent dominant 7th flat 9th harmony. The sustained B-flat and the broken thirds return, but this time the G-flat is left unresolved. It is respelled as F-sharp, and the staccato arpeggiation now implies distant B minor, making us feel even more lost than before. Beethoven highlights the G-flat, F-sharp enharmonic relationship because it will become the crux of the movement. After more wandering, we ultimately reach the dominant 7th of B-flat major at the end of the introduction through a common tone progression from A major harmony, and the moment comes as a revelation, with the trumpets and timpani playing for the first time. It is as if a sudden burst of light immediately dispelled all darkness. Incidentally, Beethoven would use the same progression in the introduction to the fugal finale of the Hammerklavier Sonata. The radiant main theme is launched by quick rising scalar figures, almost like whipping a horse into a full gallop. As you just heard, the theme itself comprises two types of melodic motion, triadic and linear. The triadic motion, rendered as a zigzag arpeggiation, is the most distinctive feature of this movement and indeed of the entire symphony. As the theme cadences, the bassoons give a comical version of it as an accompanimental figure above which the violin's measured trills add to the buffoonery. Then the main theme is restated as an energetic invertible counterpoint before its tail is treated sequentially to modulate, as we expect, to the dominant. Just before the subordinate theme begins, we get this seemingly inconsequential line in the violas and cellos. However, you can see that it is based on the zigzag arpeggiation from the main theme, but partially filled in with stepwise motion. The closing theme will be based on similar material. There appears to be two subordinate themes. The first one features rhythmically contrasting materials, but you can see that all of them incorporate the broken thirds presented at the start of the movement. The second subordinate theme presents a canon between the clarinet and bassoon, which is then taken up by the strings. This material reminds me of the closing theme from the first movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 22. Note the similarities in the overall contour as well as in the rhythm and pitch content. As mentioned, the closing theme is based on the zigzag arpeggiation from the main theme, partially filled in with stepwise motion. The development section deals mostly with the quick rising scalar figure and the zigzag arpeggiation from the main theme. In measure 221, Beethoven introduces an apparently new theme, which is actually a beautiful elaboration of the plain counterpoint to the main theme that first emerged in the transition. By far the most remarkable passage in this symphony is the retransition, which features what is arguably the most dramatic crescendo in Beethoven's orchestral music. First, Pianissimo timpani rolls already announce the tonic B flat, even though the harmony is F sharp dominant 7th and dominant 9th, implying B major. Then, after a long scalar descent that still suggests the realm of B major, an arpeggiated ascending F sharp dominant 7th harmony becomes respelled as a German 6 that resolves to what should be a cadential 6/4 in B flat major. In hindsight, then, what we've just witnessed is essentially a huge G-flat to F motion in the bass, which, as you'll recall, has already been foreshadowed in the introduction. And the bass F here, in fact, turns out to be the closest thing we'd ever get to the conventionally requisite standing on the dominant, because the upper voices would never oblige in articulating a real dominant harmony. Now here comes the exciting part. The timpani keeps insisting on B flat as the strings build up momentum through the rising scalar figure. The sheer force of the timpani's insistence combined with the build-up in texture and volume in the strings would allow the music to culminate in a strong arrival in full orchestra at the start of the recapitulation. Of course, if you're familiar with Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata, you've probably noticed that something very similar happens at the analogous spot in the first movement of that piece. Cast in sonata rondo form, the second movement is proto-romantic in its sustained lyricism. Berlioz greatly admired the pure and truly ethereal tenderness of this movement. The main theme unfolds in mostly stepwise motion down and up the scale. It is curiously accompanied by a detached dotted rhythmic figure that sometimes sounds like heartbeats. Then the pattern of zigzag arpeggiation from the first movement appears in measures 6 to 7. Incidentally, there are melodic similarities between this theme and the opening theme of the minuet from the Piano Sonata Opus 22. The zigzag arpeggiation can also be found embedded in the elaborate cadential figuration beginning in measure 34. Section C presents the main theme dramatically in the tonic minor, and the bass line begins, perhaps not coincidentally, with the G-flat to F motion that was the crux of the first movement. The scherzo movement typically has a rigid overall ternary structure in which the scherzo returns verbatim after the trio by means of the da capo sign. But this scherzo is different because Beethoven expands it into a 5-part form in which all the sections are fully written out. By doing this, the scherzo, usually the shortest movement in a symphony, becomes more substantial. The scherzo opens with the familiar zigzag arpeggiation, but now ascending rather than descending. The material is cast as an impish hemiola within the prevailing triple meter. The arpeggiation of the dominant 7th flat 9th that follows harks back to the introduction of the first movement. The trio presents a simple melodic line in more straightforward rhythm, underlying which a tonic pedal can be heard. Overall, the passage seems to evoke peasant music. And when the melody is subsequently repeated over a semitone undulation, one could imagine that the peasants have perhaps been drinking a bit too much. The last return of the scherzo is abbreviated, and at the very end, Beethoven adds 3 extra measures in which, as Schumann puts it, the horns have just one more question to ask, and the whole orchestra answers with a curt but jubilant affirmation. Lively and full of humor, the finale is a perpetuum mobile in sonata form. The zigzag arpeggiation is embedded in the running 16th note figure of the main theme, which begins in the first violins and is then transferred to the lower strings. Meanwhile, the accompanying chords in the lower strings are brought to the foreground. The zigzag arpeggiation becomes more conspicuous in the transition. Like in the first movement, the subordinate theme comprises a variety of contrasting materials, including a sudden vigorous preoccupation with the diminished 7th harmony, like an apparition of the eroica's violent dissonances. This faint eroica moment reappears in the retransition, with the diminished 7th harmony intensified into a protracted dominant 7th flat 9th. Again, you can hear the clash between F and G flat that has been prefigured in the introduction to the first movement. The recapitulation begins softly and somewhat surreptitiously, with the bassoon solo giving the main theme an unexpected color. It's almost like a parody of the strong arrival at the recapitulation of the first movement. In the coda, the dominant 7th flat 9th returns for the last time, and the G flat finally falls to F for good, resolving this obstinately persistent semitone clash. The finale ends playfully by presenting the main theme in slow motion. Then a flurry of activity builds to decisive concluding chords. Thanks for watching.